we're headed for desperate times, definitely, but not really a lot of relief in sight.
This is Swan Falls Dam, the first dam built on the Snake River. It was completed in 1901 to supply electricity to the miners in Silver City. For thousands of years prior to that, Chinook salmon would swim from the ocean up this river all the way to Shoshone Falls to spawn. The original design included a fish ladder built to bypass the system, but apparently it wasn't enough to offset the barrier created by the dam. A few short years later, the big salmon were no longer seen upriver, but this was just the beginning of their demise. In 1938, Bonneville Dam was built on the lower Columbia River, creating another barrier to and from the ocean. 7 more dams were added on the mainstream Columbia and lower Snake by 1975. The Middle Snake added 3 more, the last being Hell's Canyon Dam, built in 1967. With its completion, the steelhead and salmon runs were abruptly blocked from the upper Snake River. The 8 dams on the lower Snake and Columbia Rivers were constructed with a bypass system of fish ladders to allow the adult salmon and steelhead to make the long return trip from the ocean back to the waters of Idaho. But their offspring, the small juvenile smolts journeying from our rivers to the ocean, had been overlooked. No effective system had been set up to secure their passage through the 8 barriers to the sea. In a few years, the number of returning fish had plummeted, starting the decline that would lead to listing Idaho salmon under the Federal Endangered Species Act in 1991.
Well, I started my career in salmon and steelhead research, which is what I'm in right now, in 1964, when the wild salmon and steelhead were at very high levels, and we had excellent fisheries that were supported by those runs of wild fish. It makes me sick to see what's happened, particularly when minor changes could make these resources available to future generations.
Research biologist Terry Hollybetz is checking a fish trap or weir that stretches across Chamberlain Creek along the middle fork of the Salmon River. The weir is put into place for a few weeks in the spring to keep track of how many wild adult steelhead are returning to our rivers to spawn. Like the salmon, steelhead are anadromous fish. This means they begin their lives in the fresh waters of Idaho, and after a year or so, as small smolts, they're washed downstream through the river system of the Snake and Columbia until they reach the ocean, their bodies going through a miraculous transition from a fresh to saltwater fish. There, in the ocean, the salmon and steelhead feed for 1 to 3 years, returning to Idaho as large adult fish that can weigh in excess of 30 pounds. They seek out the stream where they began their own lives to spawn and die, leaving the seeds for the next generation.
We're greatly concerned about the status of our wild stocks back here. For example, last year we didn't get any steelhead through this weir, and this current year we only got 2 females.
The captured females were released upstream to spawn, but there will be no male steelhead to fertilize the eggs. Terry flies his small plane from one wilderness location to another, and the story is the same at every weir. Pristine rivers that once teemed with steelhead and salmon now are nearly empty of anadromous fish.
Rush Creek here is in perfect condition, and there's been no significant activity in Rush Creek to alter the habitat. It's in perfect condition to produce lots of salmon and steelhead, but yet we can't get them through the dams and back here to spawn and reproduce.
A few weeks later, Terry is flying again. This time he's in a Hiller helicopter, meticulously surveying the width and breadth of Idaho's pristine wilderness river system. The disturbed gravel that indicates a steelhead nest or red can be easily detected from the air. Miles and miles of beautiful rugged country is traversed, a remarkable sight. Clean, clear streams sparkle in the spring sunshine, but the mood is somber within the ship. A parade of zeros marks the chart, further indication that the wild steelhead stocks seem to be traveling down the same doomed path as the endangered salmon.
It's apparent, I guess, to many of us now that the things that we've tried in the past, the options that we've used in the past, are not working. Hatcheries, for one, cannot overcome the survival problems we have in the Columbia snake. Barging, for all that we've seen from that, has not overcome the survival problems.
Early studies indicated that 70 to 90% of Idaho salmon smolts never make it due to man-caused mortality. Not only do the dams create a difficult hurdle for the small fish, but the big barriers also slow their journey. In the early part of this century, the spring runoff created by melting snow would push a smolt down the river system from Idaho to the ocean in about 8 days. Since the dams were built, that same journey can take upwards of several months, especially during drought years. Many become lost in the slower water, vulnerable targets for predators. In the early 1980s, hatcheries were built to boost salmon numbers, yielding more smolts. But the captive raised fish aren't nearly as hardy as the wild ones. Despite the hatchery program, the salmon population is still steadily declining. About the same time the hatcheries were built, a system of bypasses was added at some of the dams to shunt the smolts around the big turbines and funnel them into specially built barges. These then transport the fish around the remaining dams to the ocean. But after 20 years of barging fish downstream, the number of returning salmon continues to decline.
So we're headed for desperate times, definitely, with not really a lot of relief in sight.
When Congress passed the Northwest Power Act of 1980, it declared that the anadromous fish runs must be considered equally as important as federal hydropower, and a way should be found to preserve Idaho's salmon and steelhead. Neither hatcheries or barging have even begun to restore the runs, but some scientists are suggesting an answer from the past. Recently, the Army Corps of Engineers has submitted a proposal called a natural river option. That is, extracting the earthen segment of the dams in the lower Snake River, thus removing a portion of the barriers in the path of the fish and essentially making the river run like a river again. Could such a decision be made? The National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS as it is called, is responsible for administering the Endangered Species Act relating to salmon in the Snake River. NMFS has initiated a process to help regional decision makers proceed beyond the turn of the century with dam operations on the Columbia River. The long-term options generally follow two paths. One, maintain river operations the way they are now and develop a technological fix for both smolt and adult migration through the dams, or modify river operations to more closely match the conditions before the dams were built, when salmon and steelhead were abundant. Many fish scientists are not very optimistic that the technological approach will work, since this path has been pursued for the past 20 years with little success.
When you say, look, we had a river, we had millions of fish. We produced half the spring-summer Chinook in the Columbia Basin when the river flowed like a river.
Dismantling some of those big dams sounds like a radical idea, but when we come back, we'll introduce you to a man in Boise who believes that it makes good economic sense. In fact, it may even save the taxpayer money.
I mean, if we think society's going to crumble if we take out 4 dams, we're wrong. We're going to do better without the 4 dams.
After pursuing an education, Reed Burkholder returned to Boise to teach piano and raise a family. He became interested in the salmon story after a camping trip to the South Fork of the Salmon River in 1991. There he discovered that the big fish had virtually disappeared. The Idaho he remembered as a child was gone.
I saw my first Chinook at the Sunbeam Dam in about 1955. It looked to me, from age 10, to be 40 inches long. I mean, I can still see it in my imagination. This monster fish on a clear day, you know, good color. And I asked him, what happened? You know, when I left this place, we were fishing for salmon. And now that I'm back, they're gone. What happened?
He began to read and began to ask questions until he had amassed a large file of information. Eventually, he concluded that the proposal submitted by the Army Corps of Engineers was the only answer: dismantle some of the big dams.
And so all of this led me to the notion that it's economically rational and reasonable to propose deconstructing at least 4 dams that our parents and grandparents built. And those would be Lower Granite, Little Goose, Lower Monumental, and Ice Harbor.
Reed felt so strongly about it, he built a slide presentation and took it on the road to convince others.
This picture here is a Corps of Engineers artist rendition of Lower Granite Dam with the earth section removed. With the river running through where the earth used to be, the river is now restored. It's in its natural channel. The dam is non-functional.
He found that the dams on the Lower Snake and Columbia rivers are called run-of-river dams. This means they do not provide flood control, nor do they store irrigation water for agriculture. Reed also says that the 4 dams proposed for removal provide the Northwest with only 4% of the region's power. Less than 2% goes to Idaho, shaking out to about $1.23 per household per year.
What I find out is that we have a waterway from Lewiston that ships small quantities of commodities at terrific public expense. I found out that the waterway duplicated tracks and roads that were already in place for 80 years. You know, you add up the total bill, and that wheat shipping out of Lewiston must cost $1 billion a year. Now, there's got to be a cheaper way to subsidize a few tons of wheat. And there is a cheaper way. Send it on a railroad car, give these guys who ship a tax credit for the difference between shipping by rail and shipping by barge, and let's solve this problem. And the taxpayer comes out ahead.
If deconstructing dams could restore Idaho's salmon, our state's farmers would no longer need to be concerned about irrigation water being dedicated to salmon recovery. Dvorak Reservoir would not be drawn down due to salmon.
Okay, and so all up and down the Clearwater and the Salmon River drainages, we have increased tourism and increased sport fishing. I mean, this is such a big win for Idaho.
The proposal is gaining respect, but it can be difficult for our culture to get past the perception that removing a dam is akin to destroying progress.
I mean, if we think society's going to crumble if we take out 4 dams, we're wrong. We're going to do better without the 4 dams. We're going to have some fish back. We're going to have, you know, all those cultural and social and spiritual benefits that come by being able to show our kids fish as long as our 2-year-old bodies, you know, big fish, cool fish, beautiful fish.
But for now, our state's anadromous fish runs continue to decline. If the salmon and steelhead are going to be saved, some tough decisions must be made, and made soon. Keith Carlson of the Idaho Fish and Game Commission says losing our fish is not acceptable.
For me, I guess the bottom line is we've got to protect the fish. We've got to make sure the fish get back, and we're not doing that so far. And I think that the important thing is, while we do all these studies and while we do all the experimenting and all the arguing, unfortunately, we have to keep our eye on the goal, and the goal is to restore the fish so that we have wild stocks that we can fish upon.